Most folks see the palace orbiting Elaris and assume it was built by the wealthy. Truth is, it was stolen. A Terran slave started an uprising, killed one of the richest criminals in the galaxy, and inherited the biggest luxury palace in 3 sectors. Unfortunately, freedom came with a problem. Nobody aboard knew how to defend it. What followed involved 4 drunk Terran soldiers, a fortune in hidden beryllium and precious metals, pirates with terrible timing, and the creation of one of the most famous locations in the Maraine Universe, the Orbiting Palace of Elaris. Let me tell you something. You can abduct a Terran woman and sell her into slavery. Turns out stopping her from starting an uprising, stealing your palace, and leaving your naked body floating through space is a whole lot harder. Problem was, killing the billionaire turned out to be the easy part. That wasn't the end of the problem. Because after the former slaves took over the biggest luxury palace in 3 sectors, they discovered something important. Nobody aboard knew how to defend it, and somewhere out in the dark, every pirate, scavenger, crime boss, and opportunistic idiot in the galaxy was about to realize a giant fortune was sitting in space with nobody guarding it. Folks look up at the palace orbiting Elaris today and see wealth. I see 4 drunks, 1 stolen control ring, and a whole lot of people too stubborn to die. The problem announced itself about 6 hours after the billionaire left through the airlock. Now don't get me wrong, folks were celebrating. After years of collars, orders, surveillance, and rich idiots telling everybody what to do, the former slaves finally had something they'd never had before: freedom. Their former owner was the shrewdest, most evil member of a race that took a whole planet, stripped it of its resources, and left behind a barren rock. Turns out freedom is loud. Music echoed through corridors that hadn't heard laughter in decades. Storage vaults got raided. Kitchens got cleaned out. People wandered into rooms they'd spent years being forbidden to enter. Some folks cried. Some danced. Some found a quiet corner and just sat there looking confused. One fella spent 3 hours riding a decorative anti-gravity platform through the central atrium because nobody could tell him not to. Truth is, he wasn't even using it correctly. Nobody cared. For one night, the palace belonged to them. Then morning arrived, and morning has a habit of asking uncomfortable questions. The human woman who'd started the uprising stood in the central operations room looking at a display bigger than most apartments. The control ring sat around her neck now, the same ring that had once belonged to the richest criminal in 3 sectors. Funny thing was, the ring hadn't made her powerful. It had made her responsible. 100 former slaves crowded behind her. Nobody looked particularly happy. One of the palace systems projected a status report into the air. Life support, stable. Power, reserves, stable. Food stores, adequate. Morale, high. Somebody smiled. Then the next line appeared. Defensive capability, minimal. The room got quieter. A few more lines followed. Military personnel, 0. Combat, pilots, 0. Security forces, 0. Tactical response. Capability, 0. One former slave raised a hand. That seems bad. That is bad, somebody replied. Then the palace politely informed them exactly how bad. Estimated survival. Time after hostile boarding action, 4.7 hours. The room went completely silent. One woman actually laughed, not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain runs out of better ideas. The new leader accepted her unrequested position and rubbed her forehead. Please tell me that's a mistake. It is not a mistake, the palace replied. Nobody liked that answer. The palace continued. Probability of pirate attack within 1 standard year, 87%. Probability of organized criminal interest, 94%. Probability of forced seizure of assets, 91%. A former accountant raised his hand. Can we stop asking questions? No. The numbers kept coming. Turns out inheriting the biggest concentration of wealth in 3 sectors had a downside. Everybody wanted it. The palace itself was worth a fortune. The vaults were worth another fortune. The billionaire's private reserves were worth several more fortunes. There were attached estates, luxury habitats, private docks confiscated from others like him that were not as clever. There were also manufacturing systems and enough refined beryllium hidden throughout the structure to make entire governments start asking uncomfortable questions. The billionaire had spent decades accumulating wealth. Now a bunch of former slaves owned it, which was wonderful. Right up until somebody with guns showed up. The woman activated another display. The palace appeared as a glowing hologram above the command table. Several former slaves immediately smiled. It was beautiful. Artificial lakes, gardens, observation towers, private estates, floating promenades, luxury suites. Everything polished and elegant. Then the palace highlighted all the entry points. The display changed from beautiful to horrifying. Airlocks, service tunnels, maintenance shafts, docking collars, emergency access routes, hundreds of them. The room got quiet again. One former miner squinted at the display. "How many ways are there into this thing?" the palace system answered. 211. Well, he thought about that. That's probably too many. That is substantially too many. The palace system agreed. The former slaves spent the next 3 hours arguing. Some wanted to sell everything, some wanted to run, some wanted to hire mercenaries. One particularly ambitious individual suggested creating a government. That discussion lasted almost 4 minutes before collapsing under its own weight. Eventually, the human woman stood. The room quieted. "Anybody here know how to command a fleet?" Nobody answered. "Anybody know how to defend a station this size?" Nothing. "Anybody know how to stop pirates?" Silence. One former slave raised his hand. "I got robbed once." "That doesn't count." "Figured it was worth mentioning." The woman sighed. Truth was, they all knew the answer. They just didn't like it. The billionaire had spent his life preparing for exactly this situation. He trusted nobody. He hired specialists, experts, soldiers, engineers, pilots, people who solve problems professionally. The former slaves had none of those things. They had wealth. Unfortunately, wealth without protection is just loot waiting for a new owner. The woman looked out one of the observation windows. Stars stretched forever beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, somebody was already hearing rumors. Some pirate, some criminal syndicate, some opportunistic idiots. Sooner or later they would come looking. The only question was whether the palace would be ready. The answer was no, not even close, which meant they needed help, real help. The kind of help polite governments pretend doesn't exist, the kind that drinks too much, swears too much, and survives situations that should have killed them years ago. The kind of help only Terrans seem capable of producing on an industrial scale, and that meant a trip to a forgotten little world where 4 drunk Terran soldiers were busy wasting what remained of their retirement. So, here's the thing about Terrans. If you need diplomats, there's better options. If you need politicians, there's definitely better options. If you need somebody to smile while explaining why your taxes are going up, the galaxy is full of qualified candidates. But if you've inherited a giant fortune, half the criminal organizations in known space want to steal it, and you're about 3 bad decisions away from dying horribly, you find Terrans, preferably the kind that already look half dead and are comfortable in the backwaters of the galaxy. The shuttle landed on a world so forgettable, most star charts abbreviated its name. That wasn't an accident. Folks who want attention don't move there. folks hiding from attention due. The planet had once supported mining operations. Then the mines dried up. The corporations left. The governments forgot about it. The remaining population survived through stubbornness, poor decisions, and industrial quantities of alcohol. The former slaves weren't so sure. Were people there trustworthy and loyal? The woman knew Terrans could be trusted. If they took a contract, they would defend you to the end, or they would tell you to get lost. It felt familiar. The shuttle settled onto a cracked landing pad beside a settlement that looked like somebody had built it out of spare parts and mistakes. Buildings leaned in directions architecture generally discourages. Power lines appeared to have been installed during an argument. Several structures seemed to be held together entirely through optimism. The woman leading the expedition stared through the viewport. The others asked, "Are we sure this is the right place?" "No," she replied, "but I think it's our best chance." The bar sat near the edge of town. No sign. No windows. Just a reinforced metal door and enough scorch marks to suggest conflict was a recurrent theme. One former slave studied the exterior. "Should we be worried?" "Probably." "About what?" "Everything." That seemed fair. Inside, the place smelled like old liquor, bad decisions, and medical bills. The bartender looked up once, saw newcomers. Woman like that wouldn't show up in a place like this without a good reason. He decided whatever happened next wasn't his problem. Then he went back to cleaning a glass that hadn't actually become cleaner in the last 20 minutes. The former slave spotted the Terrans immediately, mostly because nobody else in the room looked remotely dangerous. 4 figures occupied a corner table. 2 men, 2 women, all wearing mismatched tactical gear that looked older than some governments. Their clothes were patched, their boots were worn, their faces carried enough scars to make conversations awkward, and every one of them appeared spectacularly drunk. One of the former slaves frowned. "Those are the professionals?" The woman nodded. "I think so." One Terran woman lifted her drink, missed her mouth, tried again, succeeded. "Definitely professionals," one of the former slaves muttered. The leader approached cautiously. The Terrans ignored her. She waited. Still, nothing. Finally, she cleared her throat. One of the Terran men looked up. He appeared annoyed that reality had interrupted his drinking. "What?" "We need help." The Terran looked at her, then at his drink, then back at her. "No." He returned to drinking. The conversation appeared over. The woman wasn't giving up that easily. "We can pay." That got attention, not excitement, just attention. One of the female soldiers looked up. "How much?" "A lot." The soldier nodded, then took another drink. "Still no." The former slaves exchanged confused looks. This wasn't how negotiations were supposed to work. Then the bar door opened, and everything got much more interesting. 5 locals entered. Big, mean. The sort of men who solve disagreements by creating new medical conditions. They immediately noticed the Terrans. The Terrans immediately ignored them. The bartender sighed. Apparently this happened often. The biggest local approached the table. "You're sitting in my seat." One Terran soldier looked around. "Got lots of seats." "That one's mine." The Terran considered this carefully. Then he picked up his drink, moved it 3 inches to the left, and placed it back down. "There." The entire bar froze. One former slave whispered, "Is that good?" "No." The bartender didn't even look up. "That's real bad." The local grabbed the Terran's shoulder. "Now here's the thing. The local wasn't a terrible fighter. Unfortunately, he had chosen a Terran, which is sort of like bringing a shovel to a naval engagement." The Terran woman moved first. One moment she was sitting. The next moment the local was airborne. Nobody was entirely sure how it happened. Physics appeared briefly confused. Then the man crashed through a table. The fight lasted 4 minutes. One of the Terrans never stood up. He simply continued drinking while occasionally punching people who wandered too close. The second Terran woman broke a chair, not over somebody, just accidentally. The chair apparently lost an argument. One of the male soldiers used a bar stool as an educational device. Several locals received advanced instruction. The fourth Terran finally finished his drink. Then the fight ended. The silence afterward felt impressive. Broken furniture littered the room. Several unconscious bodies decorated the floor. The bartender continued cleaning glasses. Apparently this wasn't even the weirdest thing he'd seen that week. One former slave stared. "Are they always like this?" The bartender shrugged. "Worse when they're sober." The Terrans returned to their table. The leader approached again. This time they paid attention. "You still need help?" one of the women asked. "Yes." "Good." The Terran pointed at the unconscious locals. "Now you've got our attention." The woman blinked. "Why?" The soldier grinned. "Because anybody who walks into this bar looking for us after watching that little demonstration is either desperate, stupid, or carrying enough money to be interested," the former slave explained. "We inherited a palace." The Terrans nodded. Nobody reacted. "We inherited several palaces." Still nothing. "We inherited more than enough wealth to buy this entire planet 6 times over." The Terrans finally stopped drinking. Now she had their full attention. One of the male soldiers leaned forward. "Nobody inherits that much. We were slaves. We took it back and sent the evil bastard who owned us into space." "Oh, that kind of inherited. How much trouble you in?" The woman thought about it, then answered honestly. "About every kind you can think of." The Terran soldier smiled for the first time all evening. "Well, now," he set his glass down. "This conversation just got interesting." The Terrans sobered up surprisingly fast. Not completely. Nobody was performing miracles, but they became functional, which was honestly a little frightening. The shuttle ride back to the palace took 2 hours. During that time, the former slaves learned 3 important things. First, the Terrans asked a lot of questions. Second, they didn't care about feelings. Third, every answer seemed to make them more concerned. Oh, and there was the other one. These guys needed a bath. Bad. The air in the shuttle got foul fast. Roadkill foul. How many trained security personnel? None. Military veterans? None. Combat pilots? None. Weapons inventory? Limited. The Terran woman rubbed her face. "Y'all really did kill the billionaire before thinking any of this through." The former slaves exchanged looks. "Well, we were busy." "With the uprising?" "Right." The Terran nodded. "Fair enough." One of the male soldiers looked over. "How many people live aboard this thing?" "About 1,200. The Terran closed his eyes. Of course. Nobody knew what that meant. The palace appeared through the forward viewport several hours later. Its golden exterior meant to shield against radiation. Its ornate architecture was meant to impress. The former slaves still thought it looked magnificent. The Terrans looked increasingly concerned. As the shuttle approached, the full structure came into view. Attached estates, luxury habitats, private towers, observation platforms, gardens, artificial lakes, decorative spires. The palace sprawled across space like a billionaire's ego made physical. The Terrans stared at it for a very long time. Finally, one of them spoke. "Holy hell." That didn't sound encouraging. The shuttle docked. The tour began after a visit to the showers. The water was jettisoned instead of the normal recycling. Things got worse. Every room seemed larger than necessary. Every corridor seemed longer than necessary. Every decorative feature seemed expensive enough to purchase a small moon. The Terrans walked in silence, which somehow felt more alarming than shouting. One former slave proudly opened the doors to the grand central atrium. Waterfalls cascaded from 3 stories above. Exotic plants lined walkways. Sunlight simulators illuminated a lake large enough to sail boats across. The former slaves smiled. The Terrans looked horrified. One of the female soldiers finally pointed. "What's that?" "The Central Recreation Lake." "Why?" Nobody had ever asked that before. "For recreation." The Terran stared at the lake, then at the former slaves, then back at the lake. "Can it stop pirates?" "No." "Then it's useless." Several former slaves looked personally offended. The inspection continued. It did not improve. 3 hours later, the Terrans had filled an entire wall with problems. Airlocks, blind corners, power bottlenecks, structural vulnerabilities, sensor dead zones, maintenance access points, security flaws. By dinner, the wall looked less like a report and more like an obituary. One former slave finally lost patience. "You keep finding problems." The Terran soldier nodded. "That's because they're everywhere." The former slave crossed his arms. "What exactly are you saying?" The Terran stood, activated a holographic display, and projected the complex into the center of the room. The structure rotated slowly, beautiful, elegant, expensive, and impossible to defend. The Terran pointed at it. "You don't own a palace." The room went quiet. "You own a liability." Nobody liked hearing that. The Terran continued anyway. "If somebody attacks this thing, you're dead." He highlighted hundreds of access points. "If somebody boards this thing, you're dead." More sections lit up. "If somebody sabotages life support, you're dead." Even more. "If somebody cuts power, you're dead." One former slave frowned. "We're not that vulnerable." The Terran soldier smiled. That smile made everybody nervous. He manipulated the display. Suddenly, hundreds of simulated attackers appeared. The defense systems failed in under 6 minutes. The room became very quiet. One former miner raised his hand. "Can we see a different simulation?" "No." "Why not?" "Because you're still dead." That seemed reasonable, unfortunately. The Terran spent the next several hours explaining reality. Reality wasn't very popular. The palace was too large, too complicated, too exposed, too beautiful. The last one confused everyone. "What's wrong with beautiful?" somebody asked. The Terran woman laughed. "Beautiful gets shot first." That answer somehow made sense. Then came the really painful part. The Terran started identifying sections that needed to go. Observation towers, luxury wings, private estates, decorative structures, entire attached palaces. The former slaves looked horrified. One woman pointed at a magnificent floating garden. "We can't remove that." The Terran looked at it. "Why not?" "It's beautiful." The Terran nodded. "You think it will look beautiful with dead bodies floating in it?" Then marked it for demolition. Now it's beautiful debris. The arguments lasted for hours. The Terrans won every single one. Not because they were louder, because they were right. Eventually, one former slave pointed at a particularly massive attached estate. "What happens if we keep that one?" The Terran examined the display. "Then whoever attacks you gets free real estate." The estate was scheduled for removal. A week later, demolition began. That was when things got funny. The former slaves had expected precision, professionalism. What they got was Terran engineering, which is a completely different thing. The first demolition charge worked perfectly. The second triggered a power surge. The third somehow disabled gravity in 2 luxury suites and a dining hall. 27 people spent 10 minutes floating around screaming. Nobody was hurt. Several were embarrassed. The Terran engineer responsible studied a data pad. "Huh? Huh?" the former slaves asked. "Good news." "What good news?" "The charges work." "And the bad news?" "The palace is apparently connected to everything." The engineer looked genuinely impressed. "That's actually kind of impressive." The former slaves disagreed, strongly, but the work continued. But the real treasure sat behind armored blast doors buried deep within the oldest section of the palace. Refined beryllium. Enough to make governments nervous, enough to make corporations start wars, enough to transform a station into something entirely different. The funny thing about Terrans is that they rarely claim to know everything. What they usually know is somebody who does. The former slaves learned that lesson the day after the beryllium vault was discovered. The 4 drunk Terran soldiers gathered everybody in what used to be a luxury dining hall. The room had once hosted parties for wealthy criminals. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Decorative fountains bubbled quietly along one wall. It was probably the most expensive room any of the Terrans had ever entered. One of them looked around and shook his head. "Y'all know we're going to tear most of this out eventually, right?" Several former slaves looked horrified. The Terran shrugged. "Just preparing you emotionally." Then they got down to business. The palace could be saved. That was the good news. The bad news was that nobody currently aboard knew how. The 4 soldiers were trainers, pilots, and professional survivors. They knew enough about security and military operations to recognize problems. What they didn't know was how to transform a floating luxury resort into something capable of surviving in hostile space. Fortunately, they knew people, a lot of people, retired engineers, former military contractors, salvage operators, shipyard mechanics, independent pilots, weapons specialists. The sort of people who could rebuild a reactor using spare parts and profanity. The sort of people who asked one question before accepting a job. How much does it pay? When the Terrans explained that the money was available, recruitment became significantly easier. The first arrivals came within 2 weeks. A battered transport docked with the palace carry in 6 engineers, 3 mechanics, and enough tools to completely terrify the maintenance department. The lead engineer was a gray-haired Terran woman named Maggie, who looked capable of fixing a battleship with a wrench and bad language. She spent 20 minutes touring the palace. Then she announced her findings. "This place is stupid." Nobody knew how to respond to that. Maggie pointed at a decorative waterfall nearly 3 stories tall. "Why is there a waterfall in space?" Nobody answered. She pointed at an artificial lake. "Why is there a lake in space?" Again, nobody answered. She pointed at a glass observation tower. "Why is there a giant target attached to the side of your station?" One of the former slaves finally raised a hand. It was considered beautiful. Maggie stared at him. "So is a fireworks factory. Doesn't mean I want to live in one." The modifications began almost immediately. As the palace continued moving toward Terran space, work crews spread through the structure like an organized infestation. Entire luxury sections were disconnected from the main complex. Decorative towers vanished. Private estates that once belonged to wealthy elites were stripped down and separated from the core structure. Sections disappeared, mass decreased, power consumption dropped. Redundant systems were stripped out. The palace slowly became smaller, meaner, more practical. Nothing valuable was destroyed. That would have been wasteful. Instead, a tug captain named Rodriguez arrived with a pair of heavy salvage ships and a permanent look of confusion. After examining the detached palace sections, he whistled. "I have hauled mining stations, casinos, and one church somebody accidentally launched into orbit. This is officially the weirdest cargo contract I've ever accepted." His job was simple. Haul away the discarded sections, store them, then eventually bring them back once the palace found a permanent home. Rodriguez happily accepted the contract and immediately began charging extra fees for listening to explanations. While the engineers transformed the palace, the 4 Terran soldiers focused on the people. The former slaves quickly discovered that military training was considerably less enjoyable than freedom. Many of them had spent years learning how to entertain wealthy owners. Very few had experience carrying equipment, conducting patrols, or responding to security alerts. The Terrans corrected that problem, brutally. One former harem attendant complained about the weight of a training rifle. The female Terran instructor took the weapon, handed her a heavier one, and informed her that life was full of opportunities for personal growth. The attendant was not amused, the instructor was. Another trainee attempted to modify a combat uniform to make it more fashionable. The resultant argument lasted 20 minutes and involved phrases rarely found in military manuals. The Terrans remained patient. Mostly, what surprised them was how quickly the former slaves adapted. People who had survived slavery possessed a remarkable ability to learn useful skills. Within weeks, patrol teams were operating throughout the station. Security checkpoints appeared in strategic locations. Emergency response drills became routine. The palace slowly stopped behaving like a luxury estate and started behaving like a ship. Physical changes were even more dramatic. Additional generators were installed. Armor plating reinforced vulnerable sections. Sensors expanded. Internal security systems multiplied. Fighter bays appeared where entertainment complexes once existed. One engineer converted a ballroom into an operations center. Nobody missed the ballroom. Several months passed. The palace became smaller, heavier, faster, ugly from the outside. The Terrans considered this tremendous progress. The former slaves eventually learned to appreciate it. The greatest transformation happened around the beryllium reserves. Once the engineers understood exactly how much refined fuel the billionaire had hidden away, their ambitions increased dramatically. When the engineers discovered the vault, it changed everything. The billionaire had hidden many things: money, art, precious metals, rare technology. The Terran simply stared. One engineer actually sat down. Nobody knew if he was tired or overwhelmed. Possibly both. Finally, he looked up. "Do y'all have any idea how rich you are?" The former slaves exchanged glances. The leader shrugged. "Very?" The engineer laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. "Lady, if half of this is real, we can build something that'll scare pirates from 3 systems away." The room fell silent. For the first time since arriving, the Terrans didn't look worried. They looked interested, and that turned out to be far more dangerous. New power systems were installed. Advanced drives were purchased. Additional shielding generators arrived aboard heavily guarded freighters. Every week brought new contractors. Every week brought new improvements. Every week brought another reminder that somebody, somewhere, was eventually going to notice. The first warning arrived during a routine training exercise. One of the sensor operators interrupted a security drill. His voice carried through the communication system. Unknown contacts detected. The room immediately went silent. The 4 Terran soldiers exchanged glances. Months of preparation suddenly felt very real. The sensor display appeared above the operations table. Several ships, far away, running quietly, watching. The lead Terran soldier studied the contacts for several seconds. Then he smiled. Nobody liked that smile. It was the same smile people got right before something expensive exploded. One of the former slaves looked at the display. "Pirates?" The Terran nodded. "Most likely." Another former slave swallowed hard. "What do we do?" The soldier leaned back in his chair. For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely pleased. "Well," he said, "looks like graduation day showed up early." The pirates spent 3 days watching the palace. That should have been the first clue they weren't very good at their jobs. Professional predators don't linger. They identify weakness, strike quickly, and leave before somebody stronger arrives. These fellows seemed determined to conduct a scientific study on poor decision-making. The sensor operators tracked them continuously. 3 ships, medium-sized, fast enough to catch merchant traffic, armed enough to bully civilians. Not nearly dangerous enough to attack a military vessel. Unfortunately for them, they still thought they were looking at a luxury palace. The Terrans let them keep believing it. The former slaves gathered in the operations center as reports continued to arrive. Months earlier, most of them wouldn't have understood half the information scrolling across the displays. Now they recognized engine signatures, sensor ranges, and weapons profiles. The training had worked. Nobody was panicking. Well, almost nobody. One former accountant looked like he was reconsidering every life choice he'd ever made. The lead Terran soldier studied the tactical display. "They're probing." "What does that mean?" somebody asked. "It means they're trying to figure out if we're helpless." "Are we?" The Terran smiled. "Not anymore." The pirate ships continued closing the distance. Not aggressively. Carefully. Like coyotes circling a campfire. One transmission finally arrived. The operations center fell silent as the message appeared on the main display. The pirate captain looked exactly like somebody who had spent his entire life making bad decisions and surviving them through luck. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. The smile made everybody want to count their wallets. "This vessel is now under our protection," he announced confidently. "Power down your systems and prepare to receive boarding parties." The room remained silent. The pirate captain mistook this for fear. Unfortunately, it was laughter trying to escape. One of the former slaves whispered, "That sounds bad." The Terran soldier muted the transmission. Then he looked around the room. "Anybody hungry?" Several people laughed. The tension broke immediately. The pirate captain continued talking to himself for another 2 minutes before realizing nobody was listening. When communications resumed, the Terran soldier finally responded, "No." The pirate captain blinked. "No, no." The channel closed. The operations center erupted in laughter. The pirates appeared offended, which was understandable. Nobody likes having their carefully prepared threats ignored. The lead pirate vessel accelerated. The other 2 followed. That was when the palace began to move. Months earlier, the station would have drifted helplessly while waiting for somebody else to solve the problem. Now, engines the size of apartment buildings roared to life. The entire structure rotated. Armor plating turned toward the threat, shield generators activated. Power surged through systems that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. The pirates immediately realized something was wrong. Luxury palaces weren't supposed to do that. The sensor operators watched panic spread across enemy communications. One of the former slaves grinned. "They looked nervous." "They should," the Terran replied. "Fighter bays open. That was the second clue. The pirates should have left immediately. Instead, they chose optimism. History has demonstrated that optimism is often fatal. 2 attack craft launched from the palace. They weren't beautiful. Terran military equipment rarely is. They looked like somebody had built engines, weapons, and bad intentions into the same machine and then painted over the evidence. The pirate formation hesitated. The fighters didn't. One streaked beneath the lead pirate vessel and painted it with targeting systems. The second positioned itself above the formation. The message was clear. "We see you. We can hit you. Your move." The pirates chose poorly. Weapons fire flashed from the lead ship. The Terran pilots immediately stopped being polite. The first attack craft rolled sideways and returned fire. Precision bursts struck the pirate vessel's engine section. Not enough to destroy it, just enough to remind everyone who was in charge. The engine exploded. The pirate ship immediately lost acceleration and began drifting. The remaining 2 ships broke formation. The confidence vanished. One attempted to flee. The other attempted to attack. Both ideas ended badly. The palace's new weapon systems activated. Energy fire crossed the darkness. The attacking pirate vessel lost shields, communications, and most of its enthusiasm in under 10 seconds. Then sections of the ship just melted along with the reactor core, leaving a drifting, venting hunk of not much. The fleeing ship accelerated desperately. One Terran pilot watched it go, then deliberately missed. The pirate captain didn't understand at first. Then a transmission arrived. "You got lucky." The pilot paused. "Run faster." The pirate ship ran faster, very much faster. The surviving pirates disappeared into the darkness, carrying a valuable lesson about attacking unidentified orbital palaces. The battle ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The operations center erupted. People cheered. Some hugged. Others simply sat down and stared at the displays. Months of fear had finally broken. The palace had survived. More importantly, they had survived. The former slaves had defended themselves. Not perfectly, not alone, but successfully. The Terrans, meanwhile, were already reviewing sensor logs. One of the former slaves stared at them. "That's it?" The soldier looked up. "What? We won." "Yep. We should celebrate." The Terran shrugged. "We can celebrate later." That answer confused everybody. "Why?" The soldier pointed toward the sensor display. A new contact had appeared, larger, far more advanced, and moving directly toward them. Nobody recognized the transponder codes. The Terrans did. Every one of them sat up immediately. The room became very quiet. One of the former slaves swallowed. "Who is that?" The lead Terran soldier smiled. This time it wasn't the smile people got before something exploded. It was the smile people got when they realized they weren't about to die. "Good news." "What?" The pirates weren't the real test. Nobody liked where this was going. The soldier pointed at the approaching vessel. "That right there is a Terran Confederation inspection ship." The room fell silent. One former slave frowned. "Is that good?" The soldier laughed. "Depends." "Depends on what?" "Depends on how much paperwork y'all feel like filling out." The palace had survived its first battle. Now it had to survive Terran bureaucracy. And honestly, that might be the harder fight. Now, if you've never dealt with the Terran Confederation before, there's something you ought to understand. The Confederation can forgive piracy. They can forgive smuggling. They can even forgive politicians. What they absolutely cannot forgive is paperwork that ain't filled out correctly. The 4 Terran soldiers explained this while the inspection ship docked. Nobody found the explanation comforting. The inspection team arrived 6 hours later. They weren't soldiers. That somehow made them more intimidating. The lead inspector was a middle-aged Terran woman who carried a data pad like it was a weapon. Following, behind her, were lawyers, accountants, auditors, engineers, and enough specialists to make everyone aboard the palace nervous. They addressed the 4 Terran soldiers. They took names and numbers. For the first time, the slaves saw the soldiers sweat. They would stand against any enemy you put in front of them. Terran auditors were a whole other thing. The former slaves had survived slavery. They had survived pirates. They had survived a billionaire. Now they were facing bureaucrats. Several later claimed this was the most terrifying experience. The inspection lasted nearly 3 weeks. Every system was examined, every financial record reviewed, every cargo manifest audited, every beryllium reserve measured and verified. Great vaults of precious metals and gems and storehouses full of wines and alcohol from around the galaxy. The inspectors walked through every section of the palace, from the newest fighter bays to the oldest luxury suites. Nothing escaped scrutiny. One of the former slaves finally asked a Terran soldier if they were in trouble. The soldier thought about it for a moment. "Nah." "Then why are they looking At everything. Because that's what bureaucrats do. The former slave nodded slowly. That seems inefficient. The Terran laughed. Welcome to civilization. The real surprise came when the inspectors finally finished. The former slaves had expected confiscation. The Confederation had a reputation for regulating anything valuable. The palace certainly qualified. The beryllium reserves alone were enough to attract attention from several governments. Instead, the Confederation delivered a proposal. The palace would remain under the ownership of its current residents. The former slaves would govern themselves. Their wealth would remain theirs. Their businesses would remain theirs. Their future would remain theirs. There would only be one condition. They couldn't continue wandering around the frontier looking like the richest target in known space. The Confederation had a solution. Elaris. The name appeared on the display above the conference table. Several of the Terrans smiled immediately. The former slaves had never heard of it. The inspectors explained. Elaris was one of the fastest growing systems within Confederation territory. Retirement communities flourished. Ships filled its orbit. Trade routes crossed through the region. Defensive fleets maintained a constant presence. More importantly, Elaris had room. Lots of room. The Confederation proposed establishing the palace as a permanent orbital settlement above the world. The former slaves listened carefully. The offer made sense. Protection, legitimacy, trade, citizenship, a future. Everything they had been missing. The vote took less than 10 minutes. For the first time since the uprising, every single person agreed on something. The palace needed a home. Preparations began immediately. The journey to Elaris took several months. By then, the palace barely resembled the structure that had once belonged to the billionaire. The transformation was remarkable. The outside had become practical, armored, efficient, purposeful, and still elegant. The inside remained beautiful. Gardens survived, restaurants survived, living quarters improved, communities formed, children laughed in hallways that had once echoed with silence. The palace had stopped being property, it had become a home. Along the way, Rodriguez returned. Naturally, the old tug captain arrived towing enough detached palace sections to make navigation controllers cry. The man appeared absurdly happy. "I brought your stuff back." The convoy behind him looked like a small, migrating city. Additional habitation rings, luxury modules, storage complexes, commercial districts, everything that had been removed months earlier. One former slave stared at the massive collection of structures. "You actually kept all of it?" Rodriguez looked offended. "Course I did. You could have sold it." "Lady, I signed a contract." Apparently, that settled the matter. The closer they came to Elaris, the more traffic appeared around them. Freighters, military vessels, passenger liners, construction ships. The former slaves spent hours staring through observation windows while the others stared back at them. Most of them had never seen a functioning civilization before. Not really. They had seen wealth, power, and exploitation. This felt different. This felt alive. Then Elaris appeared. The world hung beneath them like a jewel. Blue oceans, white clouds, green continents. Orbital ships glimmered above the atmosphere. Trade stations drifted in carefully managed orbits. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The former slaves simply watched. The lead Terran soldier eventually broke the silence. "Pretty nice, ain't it?" Nobody disagreed. The palace entered its assigned orbit 3 days later. Thousands of workers immediately descended upon the structure. Construction crews connected the return modules. Commercial districts expanded, residential sections grew, docking facilities multiplied, businesses appeared, investors arrived. What had once been a palace became something much larger. The 4 Terran soldiers were offered contracts, heads of security. Nobody expected them to stay. Everybody was wrong. The soldiers accepted permanent positions overseeing security and training. One of them explained the decision very simply. Somebody's got to keep y'all from doing something stupid. The former slaves considered that. He wasn't entirely wrong. Years passed. The palace prospered. Businesses opened. Children grew up. Trade flourished. It became a commerce center and a luxury retreat. The well-to-do roamed its appointed halls, ate exotic dishes, and slept in luxury rooms, their every need tended to. The former slaves became citizens of the palace, then leaders, then respected members of a growing community. There was an undercurrent, an unspoken agreement with the Terrans. A council of foreign finance management. It was run by 6 of the original women slaves of the palace, intelligent, every one of them, shrewd in business and secretive. Funds were accumulated and distributed. The day would come when they would have a part to play in something greater. Most visitors never learned its history. They saw restaurants, parks, gardens, apartments, businesses. They saw success. What they didn't see was the billionaire, or the collars, or the uprising, or the pirates, or the 4 drunk Terran soldiers sitting in a forgotten bar on a forgotten world. Folks look up at the palace orbiting Elaris today and see wealth. They see opportunity. They see prosperity. I see something different. I see a Terran woman who refused to remain a slave. I see 4 drunk soldiers who knew the difference between a palace and a liability. And I see a whole lot of people too stubborn to die, because sometimes the best things in the galaxy aren't built. They're stolen from the wrong people and rebuilt by the right ones.
Well, that's the story. This is one of the final stories in the Maraine Universe. A collection of stories with connected characters and places they all come together in a new upcoming series called The Legend of the Black Fleet. If you want to dive further into the Maraine Universe, go on and look in on the playlist of my YouTube channel. Till then, see you on the next one.